Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Godels and Pat Cummings. The first time Trump mentioned that Canada should become our 51st state, I thought it was a joke. I love Canada. I have so many friends in Canada. You can't count them. Wayne Gretzky. I love Wayne Gretzky. I love so many people. I love their traditions. I love their ice hockey. But why are we paying $200 billion a year essentially in subsidy to Canada? Now, if they're a 51st state, I don't mind doing it. You must admit that sometimes his stream of consciousness and word salad riffs are funny. But is it possible that Trump's presidency is just a symptom of decades of neoliberal policies, economic inequity, media manipulation, and imperialistic bullying? Let's discuss today with our Canadian guest. We are with one of our good friends, I guess, friend of the show. You've been on a couple of times, Stephen. And I was saying before, Greg and I were chatting about how much we miss talking with you, and you have published some really great articles recently on your What's Left blog, and we thought we'd just bring you on and talk about the destruction of the democracy and the end of the world and so forth as we know it. So it'd be you can give us some advice on that. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you too?
Good. And you're in Ottawa, correct?
That's right.
Okay, and I'm in Tacoma, Washington, the West Coast. Greg is in Pittsburgh,
Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So we're all over hell and back. So hey, just a little bit of a background about you. You are a political writer, an activist, researcher. You are focused on anti-imperialism, anti-Zionism, anti-capitalism. And have written several books. We had you on most recently for your book, The Killer's Henchman, Capitalism and the COVID-19 disaster. And this was just an overview outlining problems we have with a pandemic and capitalism together, using those as discussion points. The next book that we had you on for, the first one, was Israel, Beachhead in the Middle East. And I have a confession to make that when I read that book, I was completely surprised that you were that Israel was a militarized garrison enforcing our Western imperialism. It just seemed like, well, that's kind of shocking. And it's amazing how much this is obvious now. And this book's a few years old, but you really nailed it and seem to be putting forth a game plan for what's going on over there. So, are you working on any new books?
Yes and no. Yes and no. Uh, I undertook a project which probably isn't going to go anywhere. And it's taken me quite some time. And it's mostly been a study of war. And that's not the kind of project one should get involved in. I just recently there was a sociologist named Michael Mann who produced a book on war. Uh, and he warned someone else had tried to write one, kind of like a theory of war, theory of imperialism. I'd been writing a lot about imperialism, but I realized that it wasn't really imperialism I was interested in, it was war. Anyway, one of the warnings about writing about war is that the number of causes of war are so great that if you try to create a theory that tries to account for all the various reasons why more wars might erupt, you're going to be sorely disappointed.
Mm-hmm.
So I might go somewhere with that or not. I'm not sure. But
Um,
anyway, it's been a lot of research over a long period of time.
yeah, there are wars and there are wars. Some of us think that Lenin's theory of imperialism really leads to an explanation of a certain kind of war, and it's a major war. It's probably the dominant war of the 20th and now the 21st century. And I don't know, you see that as inadequate, or you see that as needing modification, or you see that as central to your thinking about war?
I began this project by reading everything that Lenin had written between 1914 and 1918. And it was quite impressive. I mean, if you read, well, first of all, I don't think many people read all of Lenin's works, because who would? Unless you're interested in something specific like this. But I was impressed by the subtlety of Lenin's thinking. And it also struck me that most people have not really understood his thinking on war, or Marxist-Leninists have often not really understood or grasped what it was he had to say. But it was also interesting how his views shifted over time, over those 4 years. Shifted not drastically, but somewhat. But that should be expected because circumstances changed from one year to the next. So his views shifted as with developments. Is it entirely adequate? I don't even think he would say his view was entirely adequate. He recognized the gaps in his view, what he didn't know and what he could account for. It was a very subtle and very well argued and sophisticated account of war. And one of the things I've considered doing is simply doing a review of his view of war, as kind of laid out in those 4 years in which he was writing about the First World War.
Do it. Do it. You were gonna need some therapy, though. I'm assuming you just having your whole being engulfed in war and conflict. There must be some stress associated with that wears on you. You know, be like doing a book on studying on child abuse or something. And at some point in time, I'm sure that's tough. So.
I mean, I went all the way back. I mean, I was inspired by Keith Richards. I was watching a video with Keith Richards, and Keith Richards is talking about, what he did. You know, if I was interested in this person, this musician inspired me. And so what you have to do is you look at the musicians who inspired you, and then look at the musicians that inspired the musicians that inspired you, and go back and back and back and so on. And so I kept going back in time. You know, you go back from Lenin, and then you go back before Lenin, and you make your way all the way back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So this has been this broad survey I've been doing, deciding that perhaps my views were a little dilettantish. And the next book I wrote, I didn't want to be as superficial, perhaps, as the ones that I've written previously. Right. Superficial from my perspective, but you could say.
Why do you think you were superficial? I mean, how do you arrive at that judgment about your own views? I don't know that others feel that way about your views. I mean, the ones that I'm familiar with.
Well, it might be part of my character, simply
Well,
being
dissatisfied
with the work that I do. I was just reading the last book you mentioned, the one, not the last one, the one on Israel. I just read the last 2 chapters before this. I wasn't particular. There's some good arguments there, I thought, but there are things that I would change. But looking back at the 4 books I have written, I've noticed that there is one book that stands out in terms of sales, and
Which one is that?
This is the one on Korea.
Oh, that's the only one I haven't read. I read your Syria book. I haven't read the Korea book. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I didn't know you had a Korea book. That's
yeah.
yes.
It's called Patriots, Traitors, and Empires.
Uh-huh.
And I was trying to discern, to understand why it has sold better than all of the rest. Much better, by far. Mm-hmm. And it suddenly struck me as I kind of inadvertently modeled my approach after one established by probably the premier American historian of modern Korea, was Bruce Cummings.
We got his book. Yeah, I tried to get him on that. I was shocked. I was shocked when I read that book because my dad was in Korea and he was a navigator there, and I just didn't realize how horrible our campaign was against North Korea. I mean, it just was. I was beyond the pale how aggressive we were in destroying North Korea. So anyway,
It struck me though that the reason it became so, I'm not going to say popular, but the most popular of some books that aren't that popular, um, was because it tells a story in kind of it's not a fiction, but it tells the kind of story that you tell in fiction, one that emphasizes a conflict. So it's traitors and patriots. We've got good guys and bad guys in the empire. Empires, the bad guys. But there's a good guy here and there's some bad guys. So people like that. They like these kind of black and white, stories which have some conflict and then you have a resolution. Um, and I think that's one of the reasons it's been so popular, because it's an interesting way to consume history, because it resonates with the way in which people tell stories. And perhaps some of the best historians are people who know how to tell stories, not to. I mean, I think that's why it was popular. Sometimes I look at that and then I say, well, I told the story, but if you want to tell a story, you omit all kinds of things that if you're an academic historian, you probably regret that you had done.
mm-hmm.
But anyway, that has been the most popular, the least popular book of all by far is the one on COVID.
I
And I kind of expected that was the case when I was going to write it, because I thought, who's going to want to read about a pandemic at the end of a pandemic? No
Well,
one.
there were some interesting things in there. You talked about China and how they approached it, and that was maybe a little bit dated. I thought you did a pretty good job about how when you have a for-profit health system, this is what you get. Don't be surprised if,
Yeah.
people are, if you're not very effective in dealing with that. I love the way you talked about China. With China doesn't have that much money, and so all of these campaigns of locking people down weren't because they were this authoritarian, rule. It's they didn't have the infrastructure to deal with this, and they had the potential to have this thing spread remarkably. And no one really talked about that in the popular press. They just talked about the horrible communist Chinese being authoritarian with their population. They're being
I'm not,
compassionate,
I'm
huh?
not going to affect I'm not going to affect your sales. I'm just one person. But what I like about your writing is that it's a pull model. That is, uh, it's pulled by a search for truth. I mean, what I read when I read your blog, for example, and I think that's something that's so absent. I mean, we've had what, three years now, Pat, 4 years of doing this together,
Yeah, yeah.
and we've had lots and lots of authors on, and it's always a percentage. It's nobody is a completely commercially driven writer, but most of the authors we are commercially driven in the sense that they factor that in. Is it going to be popular? How can I contrive a title that will draw people in? And something's lost by doing that, in my humble opinion. Pat may not agree. But what I like about your writing that I follow, and I wasn't familiar with your Korea book, is that it's based upon a search for truth. It sounds very old fashioned, but it's what I look for, and that isn't going to get you a lot of book sales, I'm sure. Um, but I don't think it's the author's fault. I think it's the fault of the education system that we have, you know, certainly in the States, and and the kind of popular culture we have in the States, so on and so forth. So if you do, I'll use this ugly word, pander to that, you sacrifice a great deal in the end in terms of getting at the truth. Because getting at the truth is a process. It's not an end goal. You don't, here it is, everybody take it. It's a process. You get closer and closer. So whatever disappointments you have with your final chapters are because the world has changed. Not so much that you were wrong, in my opinion. But again, I don't want to get, this is like methodology. What about what's going on today?
Right.
What are your thoughts? I mean, I remember when the Ukraine war started, and I was happy to see that you were one of the very few people that I agreed with that thought the critical issue was peace and not taking a side. And I caught some hell around that, and I know you did because you were associated in a couple of cases with me and a few others. What do you think's going on today? What's your estimation of where we are today?
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you raised that question. Because I did find this rather frustrating at the time, in that I was talking to people who identified as Marxist-Leninists, for example, and wanted to take a side, as you said, and usually siding with Russia. And it struck me that a lot of people who were in communist movement or the Marxist-Leninist movement often didn't have a very good knowledge of Marxism-Leninism, but were in the movement because they said they're opposed to US imperialism. And so, which is fine, but I mean, they often came through it because they identified with the Soviet Union, which is also fine. But they didn't have much awareness of what Marxism-Leninism was, except as it related to maybe the period of the Soviet Union in which you're trying to establish socialism in one country. And at the time, just before that, I had been reading The ABCs of Communism by Preobrazhensky and Bukharin, which I thought was really well done. And I know a lot of people who call themselves Stalinists would despise the book because they wouldn't have liked the authors, even though they're old Bolsheviks. But I thought it was very well done because it addressed some issues that are relevant to today. And if we want to think about, if you were a Marxist-Leninist and you're thinking about today, what aspects of Marxism-Leninism are most relevant to what's going on today? I don't think what's most relevant to what's going on today were all of the issues that concerned people like Stalin, or even Lenin later on, about how to build socialism in Russia in a particular time and in a particular time. What's relevant today were the kinds of things that Lenin was addressing before the revolution, or Bukharin was addressing, or Trotsky, or any of the old Bolsheviks. Those are the things that are relevant today. What's not relevant today is how do you build socialism in Russia, because that's just not a question that's relevant. But what is relevant is how do you, or what do you do, or how do you address questions of socialism or bringing about revolution, or what do revolutionary parties do in a time or a non-revolutionary time? All of these things that the Bolsheviks were addressing before the revolution are relevant today. And that was the kind of perspective I tried to bring to the issue of the Russian war on Ukraine. But it didn't go over very well with people
Well,
who identified as
yeah,
Marxist.
of course. I mean, I went through the same thing, and I noted a year later that there was no anti-war movement, and then there was an incipient anti-war movement in the States. It was pathetic, and it became hugely sectarian. It has not shaken my belief in Marxism-Leninism by far, but I think a lot of it flows out of the disappointment of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which didn't affect just Marxist-Leninists, but people on the left in general. And they were distraught, and so many of them turned to international solidarity, internationalism, solidarity with Latin America. They latched on to the pink revolt in Latin America and so forth. Anything but to deal with socialism as a construction in their own country. And it's just as true today. And I had this discussion with a very active person, prominent person. Pat knows who he is, written several books about various struggles around the world. I said, quite frankly, I'm frustrated that everyone ran away to do solidarity work, and no one wants to talk about the opportunity that's opening up today in the United States and in European countries to maybe attack capitalism, to go after capitalism there. I mean, Bellamy Foster just writes incessantly about the aristocracy of labor, as though it's done. You can't do anything in the global north. It's all in the global south. Well, the truth is, not much is going on in the global south of interest. But it's distracted people who call themselves Marxist in general, and Marxist-Leninist and a subset, from working in this direction, from trying to build something going forward that attacks capitalism. It's ripe at this particular moment. Most of what they're reacting to is directly connected with, caused by contemporary capitalism of this moment.
You're right.
So I don't give up. Don't give up, please. I mean,
Okay. Well,
associate myself with your
I've got a
feeling.
couple. I've got a couple of your articles. What I like about you is I'm sounding like I'm a, little, you're a rock star and I'm a groupie or something like this, but is that you've got so much gumption to say stuff and you say it early, like your book on Israel, The Beachhead. That was, that was said early. Here's something you wrote on is glorifying Hamas, October 7th, attack strategically unsound. That occurred in October. This is the 1st of November, and you're taking on this fellow in Jacobin, I guess the contributing editor Jacobin, and the gist of it is you're telling him that you're manipulating international law in kind of a hypocritical way to support colonialism. You're going overboard and saying, "Oh, we've got to condemn Hamas. We've got to condemn Hamas," and you're saying, "Well, wait, step back a little bit and look at what's really going on here with this situation in the Middle East and the two-state solution." And spending a lot of time expressing how horrible the situation is and how a lot of these people will use international law as a way of arguing for their side, and there's some mendacity in that. Did I catch the gist of that article for you? I mean, close? You can tell me no.
Yeah, yeah. And I was, I think I wrote that just about a time I stumbled on something that's known by the acronym TWAIL, which means
Well,
Third World Approaches to International Law, which is somewhat like a Marxist approach. I probably prefer the Marxist approach. But in the Marxist approach to international law or to law is to ask, well, who writes the law? I mean, law doesn't exist outside of human beings. Doesn't it's written by certain people, certain classes write the law.
right.
And there seems to be this fetishization of international law, especially in the left. I mean, always talking about international law or international law is going to save the Palestinians. It's not Hamas that's going to save the Palestinians or a resistance that's going to save the Palestinians. It's the international community and international law. But who developed international law? Well, who developed international law were large powers, great powers that wrote international law to serve their own interests. And where they don't serve their own interests, or where that law doesn't serve their own interests, great powers simply ignore it. It's an institution that serves the interests of the people who write it, and people who write international law aren't Palestinians, and they aren't weak people, and they aren't oppressed people, and they aren't exploited classes. So this idea that we should fetishize international law and expect that's going to be the salvation for people struggling for liberation is completely misleading. But that's always, I mean, for decades and decades, Palestinian scholars, Palestinian intellectuals have recognized that international law is never going to save the Palestinians. Although there are lots of people who still promote that idea because they have nothing else to promote. I mean, they want liberation without violence, as if that's ever going to happen, or as if that has ever happened.
This is in November 1, and you're talking about violent resistance is legitimate against oppression. And nobody was talking about that then. Now, all of the comedians and Theo Vaughn had a tearful confession about how he's was upset that there's a genocide in Gaza. He did that last week. You know, this we're in May. Uh, anyway, I let me give you another example again of why I'm such a fan. Here, you just recently did this one. U.S. does to Canada what Canada has helped the U.S. to try to do to other countries. Okay, so we've got a clown in the presidency. He is entertaining, you have to admit that. And he wants you to be the 51st state because he loves Wayne Gretzky, he loves ice hockey, he loves, just God. And so most people are expressing, how ridiculous this is, how much solidarity is coming out of Canada because of this, how your elections were recently impacted by him. And what you said is, hey, smell the roses, baby. We've been doing this for a long time, destabilizing countries, using sanctions inappropriately. These tariffs are, Trump's not in charge. I think we'll all agree with that. But it is just a expression of how we do business. And so don't get all upset now when you've got something silly about the 51st state thing. Look at the bigger policy of what we've done in Iraq, Venezuela, Cuba, Syria, go on and on and on. Did I catch that? How did I do with that, Professor? Is that a reasonable overview of your position on this matter?
Well, I was particularly concerned with the hypocrisy of Canadians because what Canadians didn't like was that Americans are doing to them what they had done to other countries. I said, well, that's fine if you do it to other countries. You just can't do it to us. I mean, we thought we were your friends, and now you're behaving toward us the way you behave toward others, and we helped you behave toward those same countries.
Right, right, right.
And that's the case. So what's happened is that it's the case of the United States turning the policies it used against third world countries, the global south, now against its own allies in the global north. And Canadians taking great exception to that. So there's a premier, that's the equivalent of a governor of a state, premier of Ontario, that's the largest province in Canada, has been on US media a lot talking about how the United States ought not to behave toward Canada in this fashion because we should be building, as he calls it, a Can-Am fortress where the United States and Canada can take on the world. And why are you doing this to us? He would say, you should be doing that to Mexico. Let's do it together to China. Let's go after all these
China, yeah.
countries. Let's get together and gang up on the rest of the world the way we usually do it. That's what Canadians took exception to.
Well, your writing is clear about it. We just sort of flippantly throw out these things of just sanctions here, sanctions, tariffs, and I think it was in one of your earlier writings about how destructive these sanctions are. I mean, they are. You talk about taking a 2,000-pound bomb and blowing up an apartment building in Gaza. Well, 50,000 children dying in Iraq because of our sanctions. that's, that's a pretty big bomb. Uh, Venezuela, we're so upset about what is it, the 13 MS-13, all that, the gangs and everything. And we don't talk about how we literally collapse their economy with our sanctions, their oil economy, and created hyperinflation. We did that with our policies, and yet are upset that some gangbanger is, running amok in Brooklyn. I don't know. What do you think, Greg? I
Well, my litmus test is Cuba, and what's really disappointing with our world is that they've been victimized the longest by U.S. foreign policy. I guess Canadians still go to Cuba and recreate or visit their hotels or do their women or whatever they Canadians do. We're not allowed to do that. But in general, the world has just turned its back on Cuba. Cuba's resisted the U.S. Foreign policy, the U.S. government, our government, since its inception, and yet that continues, and they become more and more impoverished. Power goes out for lengthy periods of time because they can't access any kind of equipment. Maybe even more disappointing is that the rest of the world, which has benefited greatly from the solidarity of the Cubans, for example, Angola, to name a name, or the Vietnamese, to name another name, have done so little in return to help Cuba, or China, which is the largest economy by some thinking, certainly the second largest economy in the world, has done very little to help Cuba out. And I don't mean that as an indictment of Cuba. I mean it as an indictment of the level of solidarity we have in the world. When it comes right down to it, it's very disappointing, and it shows you what a deep hole we've dug for ourselves, all of us globally, by letting this system run amok now since 1991, and call it neoliberalism or globalization. I think those are all bogus words that just sound good, celebrity words. But whatever that international system is, it's led to this kind of result. Um, my liberal friends, and I have many of them, they what's going to come after Trump? Well, it's only going to get worse. I mean, you can't just passively sit by. If you follow Berlusconi in a trajectory in Italy, now you have Maloney. It's just going to get worse if you have no opposition built that offers people an answer. This is what you're going to get.
Well, talking about Cuba, I mean, there's a similarity between what the United States has done to Cuba and what it tries now to do to Canada.
mm-hmm.
Not to the same extent. I mean, the United States has completely devastated Cuba. I've been there, and it wasn't a pleasant trip, actually. I mean, it's one thing to read about what the sanctions and the blockade have done to Cuba and to look at it intellectually, and it's quite another thing to see it. It's very distressing. It's not a nice place. And it's not a nice place because of the blockade. And why has the blockade been imposed? I mean, here's the model. Why is there a blockade imposed? You have to have laws. That's deceptions. The whole US model of strangling a country economically is first to suggest that it's some kind of threat, in which case the threat is based on a complete deception. And then you have to explain why it is that the Cuban economy is essentially collapsed, why parts of Cuba look like, or Havana look like the backdrop you have, Greg, when you're there. And if you read in the US press, why is that? It's because socialism doesn't work, or because of mismanagement, without any talk about the decades and decades of economic strangulation. But the same thing is what the United States now tries to do to Canada to coerce it into becoming the 51st state. So we're going to use economic measures to make things unpleasant for Canada, which Canadians don't, I mean, obviously object to. But this is going to be accompanied by deceptions about why is it that the United States is going to do that? Well, it's because of fentanyl, for example.
Oh, God.
So just recently, Kash Patel has been talking about, wow, we've sealed the borders, the Mexican border, so there's no fentanyl coming in from Mexico, but we still have lots of fentanyl coming into the country. So where is it coming from? No other place but Canada. It's Canada. So we have to do something about Canada, continue to impose our sanctions on Canada to coerce, bully it into becoming the 51st state. That's not much different from what the United States has done to Cuba or to North Korea or to Venezuela or countless other countries. And I think you were alluding to a term I used, economic atom bomb, which
Yes,
wasn't
that was the
mine.
one. Yeah. Yeah.
But there are two political scientists, John and Carl Mueller, who wrote this famous paper in Foreign Affairs about sanctions of mass destruction about Iraq, arguing that if you looked at all of the people who had died in Iraq as a result of US sanctions, you found that the number was greater than all of the people who died from the use of weapons of mass destruction, including the use of chemical weapons in the First World War. So they called them sanctions of mass destruction, which was an apt phrase. And then the philosopher and historian, Lasordo, started talking about economic atom bombs, which seems maybe a little bit over the top, but expressed the same idea, which was that you could produce as much death and devastation through economic sanctions and blockade and strangulation as you could by dropping an atomic bomb. So it might be appropriate sometimes to talk about economic coercion and sanctions as economic atom bombs.
We're just such dicks, though. But we kept syringes out during the COVID. They didn't have enough syringes in Cuba, and we embargoed the syringes. What kind of cruelty is that? We're destroying the cut flower industry in Colombia and certain other places, that we intentionally set that up, that they would grow flowers. All of our tulips, roses, such come from Central America. And we wanted to give them an economy that was something other than their drug economy. So we encouraged the development of these farms, and it worked out great. You can get roses pretty cheap, delivered next day. But now we're having these sanctions, and it's literally destroying all these farmers. Tell me about our media. I don't know much about your media. I'm sure it's as crappy as ours is, though. And their inability to
It's crappier,
frame,
actually.
is it crappier?
Much.
Okay. Well, then that's good. I mean, that's bad. Okay, so let me give you an example. Here's an example. This was it yesterday or the day before yesterday? The New York Times had this big expose about Project Esther, a
Read about it.
national strategy to combat anti-Semitism. And they have their podcast, their New York Times podcast. They mentioned Project Esther. And for those that don't know Project Esther, it's this very aggressive, active campaign to discredit anybody that is against Israel or pro-Palestine. Pro-Palestine is the thing. So that's where you get the gal was booed in Colombia, because because Project Esther ended up kicking these kids out of school that were protesting Palestine and so forth. So this is horrible. They finally get around to doing something. Ryan Grimm's and Dropsite News had a complete expose of this more than a year ago. Is it Scahill is part of Dropsite? I think he is too. And I
Yeah.
went online and looked at their information. They literally took the Heritage Foundation, the project, since the project, they laid it all out, how they're doing it. What the hell how bad is that we could have in plain sight this horrible policy, this extremely destructive, that's getting people arrested and beaten up in airports. And only recently, New York Times is just, oh, we're shocked. Clutch the pearls. there's an active campaign to discredit people that are in support of Palestine. What can you do about that?
Trump had adumbrated that quite some time ago. He said he was going to do that. He usually says what he's going to do, and then it happens. So, I mean, this wasn't really anything new. I mean, he'd been threatening this for quite some time. He was threatening this during the campaign.
Yeah, yeah. It's a
At the
mess.
same time that he said that he knew nothing about the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025.
Well, I Greg and I've had several conversations. We don't agree on everything, but we generally have been increasingly agreeing that Trump's rise was predictable and that Trump is not necessarily the problem. It's all of this years and years of neoliberalism, and I start with the Powell Amendment if you want to get, way back. Assault on our institutions, expansion of imperialism, the military complex growing. He's
Well,
just a clown that
fact,
happens to be in there. He's not the problem. I mean, he could have a massive stroke tomorrow, and they'd prop him up like Dianne Feinstein in Weekend with Bernie, and they'd keep going. What do you think, Greg?
well, facts are useless. Facts are useless because no one draws conclusions from facts. No one reads history and sees parallels. And that's the essence of Marxism, is to find connections between historical facts and how they fit together. Do they create patterns, and are there processes that are revealed, and so on. And I refuse to talk about current events because everybody clicks their tongue and says, "Oh, it's so bad, it's so bad," or "Do you know this?" And then we outdo each other on the left by telling our colleagues and friends, "Well, I know an outrage even greater than the outrage you know," but no one draws any conclusions about the process that lies behind it and how you might go beyond that process. And to cut the whole thing short, if you do follow the tracks, if you do follow the trail and where it leads to capitalism. And that no one wants, I'll talk about anti-capitalism, but not the logical conclusion of that is you got to get rid of it. And what that is called is socialism. So when you have no one really seriously building that or looking at that or putting that in, as part of their worldview and their explanation, then facts are meaningless. Yeah, it's bad. It's bad here. It's bad there. Social Security might go away. It was bad enough. It's bad enough. I'm on Social Security. I can tell you about Social Security. I can tell you about the process that when it was originated in the 60s, that is effectively free for my uncle who worked in the coal mines. And today I pay as much, into it to get my medical coverage and so on, into the Medicare system as I did when I worked when I was working before I retired.
Yeah,
So I know the process, and I know why it's the way it is, and what the forces behind it are, and how we got here. But no one wants to hear that.
yeah, you'll learn about that when we take over you as a state. You'll learn about how and get rid of your health care. You'll be bitching about that at the coffee shop. So, do you see any hope that we can have a movement that's going to, like Greg said, confront capitalism as more of the basic virus that's making us so sick? Um, is there any hope to return to a more socialist approach to this, dismantling our our system, or is it? Will our media never allow that? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, that's
Small
right.
question.
The media would never allow that. But it means you have to create different medias. Maybe to approach that, I should ask Greg a question because I read Greg's last two articles, or I've actually read more than that, but your last two articles that you wrote on Marxism-Leninism today
Mhm.
seem to address some issues that you've been broaching right now. some frustration at the absence of an anti-capitalist or socialist perspective. And then you were also writing recently about, was it the warfare position versus the warfare maneuver. And while I was reading those articles, they raised for me the question that Eric Hobsbawm once asked, which I don't really have the answer to, but it would be interesting to see what views you have. And that was the question of what do revolutionaries, or what does a revolutionary party do in non-revolutionary times?
Well, yeah, and embedded in that article about Gramsci, I think it's just a sentence or two. I didn't elaborate on it, but my thinking is that you've got to go into the labor movement and spark something within the labor movement, which none of the left is doing. The Marxist-Leninist parties, even in Europe, aren't doing that. They're not basing their approach on invigorating, igniting the working class movement, which is the only place you can get there. And I give the PCI, the Italian Communist Party, credit in the old Red Belt days for trying to create an alternative culture, an alternative medium in places where there are workers, whether it be music or film or what have you. I mean, they did command most of the major filmmakers in Italy, and that was a big deal, particularly in 1945 into the early 50s. So, I mean, it begins with looking to see where there might be a force that could be organized and try to help shape that force. That's no different than what is to be done. I'm just repeating what is to be done, but in more popular language, and try to get your friends and allies, call it a party if you like, but we don't have any real parties we can depend on at this stage, but get them to embed in that movement and change it and work with it and develop some of the intellectuals that are in that movement. They're intellectuals in that movement. And it's incredibly difficult, but you've got to commit to it. I mean, to me, the problem is not how difficult things are. They're stunningly difficult, unbelievably difficult. We can only begin to do this project, but we got to begin, and we got to begin by dropping all this garbage about all these writers that are writing about capitalism as though it's if we got rid of neoliberalism, it would be wonderful. That's essentially what you have. So I mean, I think we got to find either embed that in the existing left movements, existing Marxist-Leninist movements, which have that shortcoming, but I don't see any of them really committing to working to develop and build the working class into what it potentially could be. I use the example of WCFL, which is the call letters were Chicago Federation of Labor. It was a radio station for years and years, was owned and operated by the labor movement in Chicago, which wasn't terribly militant through most of that period, but it was a voice of labor. There are no voices of labor. There are no paid newspapers of labor. There's no culture of labor that's being put forward by anybody. Since McCarthyism stripped and eviscerated the leftist labor movement, it's just been hacks. They're just hacks. Many of them are my friends and they're hacks. Sorry, I'm calling them out. They're hacks. They could have done more.
So when you say the labor movement, you're talking about the organized labor movement, unions?
I'm talking about the
Unionized
working
workers?
class, but the place that you have to penetrate, the place where the point where you have to try to get in is through the labor movement. You can't really go around them. That's been tried. It's been tried. Anarchists tend to go around them. You've got to go in. It's very dangerous, not physically dangerous, ideologically dangerous work. I mean, you've got to kind of have a handle, a comfort with working class people. Most of the people that speak for the left that I know, even the Marxist-Leninist left, they don't know any working class people. They don't hang out with them. They don't live with them. They aren't among them. So I mean, that's the challenge.
That raises the question, though, about how you define working class or working class people. What are they?
A broad, very broad definition. People that
Hmm?
work for a living, people that do not own, for the most part, uh, the means of wealth creation. I use a broader term, wealth creation. For example, in America, in this country, recent report by Zuckman, of all the wealth in the United States, 50% of the people only command 3% of that wealth. And almost all of that wealth is in their home or their cars or things like that. The other 50% have the majority of it, but the vast majority of it, 67% of it, is in the top 10%. So the battle is really for the minds of those workers that are in that call it aristocracy of labor, if you will, but that grouping that's beyond the 50%. They're the critical people that we have to win. So those are working people. I mean, ownership of the creation of wealth is clearly in the hands of it, at least the top 10% of the population. They really
Right.
are the creators.
So what percentage of the U.S. population would you say belongs to the working class?
That's tricky, and it's tricky because no Marxist-Leninist or anyone else that I know of has been able to define and characterize properly the upper middle strata, what it is. We know it's there. It's sort of like atomic particles, you know, the subatomic particles. We know it's there, but we don't have a definition of it. Is it 20%? Is it 10%? There have been scholars that have shown politically how they function. They function with one foot when they're with the ruling class, with the capitalist class. But I'd say it's fair to say that 2/3 of the people in this country are workers in some sense or another.
Okay. Well, I'd agree with that.
Okay, what do you not agree with, Stephen?
I'm not sure if I disagree with you or not.
Is the idea that all of the Starbucks stores are unionized, is that really going to solve our problem? Probably.
That's the wrong way to solve our problem, isn't it? I mean, that's not really what we want to do.
Right.
That's what dilettantes on the left, not all, I mean, I have close friends that are involved, like Chris Townsend and others, but
Right.
many of the people that talk about that or hail that are the dilettantes of the left. They're not serious about the workers in the Midwest, the people that voted for Trump in Wisconsin or even Pennsylvania where I live. They're not serious about approaching them and taking their concerns seriously. They're not concerned. They don't know what life is like where I grew up in Illinois, in central Illinois. Used to be industrial. They have no idea. They blather on about workers, but they don't mean that.
So in the United States, what percentage of the population would belong to a union? It's
Less than
pretty small,
10%.
isn't it?
Less than
There's
10%.
two types of union. There's the public service union, then the private union, like Amazon. Then there's
Right.
also the
Add them together, it's less than 10% of
Right.
density. Union density is less than 10%.
yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm. So it wasn't clear to me whether you're defining the working class as that less than 10% or something.
No. But I mean, that's the place that's why it's such difficult work, is because you've got to realize it's there. Now we tried to build a labor party here in the 80s. And the obstacles to it was the labor movement. I mean, the organized labor movement, which part of it created, then became the obstacle to moving it forward. So that's the kind of contradictions you have in this country, and they require people to make a lifelong commitment to change it.
Well, interestingly, in Canada, there is what might be considered equivalent or close to a Labour Party. It's called the New Democratic Party. It's a social democratic party, originated in a social democratic movement. And it seems to have two constituencies. One, organized labor, and some of the like automobiles, steel,
Right.
that kind of thing. And the other is in urban areas where you have usually unionized government workers. And they're a very different kind of constituency. The unionized government workers tend to have university educations, well-educated, different concerns than workers on the assembly line, for example, at Ford, or working in a steel mill. And that party seems to have difficulty appealing to both constituencies. And it appeals to them in different ways. So, for example, the NDP, a New Democratic Party candidate in the riding in which I live, which is more of a, you might say, well, it's it's within Ottawa, so it's in a downtown urban area, which occasionally, well, provincially, within our province, we have a representative from the New Democratic Party. In our federal election, the representative for the New Democratic Party didn't win. But what policies were he promoting? Was he promoting things like arts funding? You know, it's kind of, well,
that's the advantage we have, and the disadvantage we have is we don't have a Labor Party that we could even think about working with. But the advantages we have is things are far worse here, and it's so developing issues is far easier. And even in urban areas like here, 40% of the city of Pittsburgh is nonprofit. It's not taxed. There's no payment of taxes by eds and meds, and so the city's is constrained on what it can do for people going forward. We have a housing crisis. So, I mean, the neglect that's happened here because of the backwardness of our politics affords us a particular advantage in terms of developing issues. We're not going to go there to arts and things like that. The disadvantage is that we're so far back. You're talking about an urban and industrial working class division. We're talking about a division on organized labor between the building trades, which really run the labor movement here, and the industrial unions. So that's even to the right. At least your urban service sector workers they're educated. Probably there's a lot of socialists among them, a lot of people that believe in progressive ideas. The building trades doesn't. They just want jobs. They want their sons to, be plumbers, and they keep blacks out. I mean, they're really backwards. So it's much, much harder to even get started here, but that's what it's going to take. So I'm not negative about it. I'm negative about the fact that people don't see a pathway. It doesn't have to be my pathway, but something close to what I'm talking about. Not just babbling on about disaster capitalism, whatever that means, And that's what we have. We have book after book after book that attaches a term to capitalism. It's not capitalism we're against. It's some kind of capitalism. Well, capitalism produced disaster capitalism. Can't you utter the word capitalism, or even better, socialism? No, they can't. You're not going to be a celebrity if you do that. And that's essentially that's the great contradiction of our left, is the prominent people, the Richard Wolffs, the Klein, and others like that. They don't really believe in socialism. They don't dare utter real socialism because they won't be celebrities. Chomsky. Sorry, Pat. Chomsky, he's not going to utter that.
You have to be nice about Chomsky.
Yeah, that's Pat's idol.
Stroke. Yeah, that's my personalized license plates say Chomsky. So Greg knows how painful it is when he disses my friend.
He never offers me a ride. He won't offer me a ride in his car. So
yeah.
You never see those plates.
You can get a ride in my wife's Tesla. That was debadged. We debadged the T off the Tesla and put a peace sign on. So we're now officially okay to be driving to our friend's house and stuff.
Hungarian car now. It's an Hungarian car.
Yeah, good.
One of the problems of even talking about socialism is defining it. One of the most popular blog posts I've ever had was called "Do publicly owned planned economies work?" I mean, it has hundreds of thousands of people have read this. And when I was writing it, I was going to ask, does socialism work? But I thought, well, you can't do that because there's so many different understandings of what socialism means. So I thought I'd try and define it in a more concrete way. But it's interesting. I mean, if you're trying to be optimistic here, it's interesting that that has generated so much interest. People find that fascinating. The whole idea, does it work? And I had to point to really existing socialism, which was to point to the Soviet Union and say, okay, so it had lots of problems, but we can look at this. We can ask certain questions about it. Does it work? Did it work within that particular setting, in that particular context? And would it work within our own? I mean, if it worked in that particular context, it's going to work even better in our own, because there's so many obstacles to a publicly owned publicly planned economy working well under such unfavorable circumstances in the Soviet Union. There's another interesting thing, though, about examining or going back and reading some of the classics of Marxism, particularly the works of Marx and Engels, was the idea that seemed to be implicit in their work that the advantages of socialism would be obvious to everyone. That at a certain point, it would be obvious to the working class, so that the working class would embrace it. What they didn't take into account was how effectively the capitalist world would be able to discredit socialism, especially by pointing to the Soviet Union or the Eastern Bloc, without taking into account why these societies didn't produce as much abundance as, for example, the United States did.
Can you just imagine if the Soviets had the infrastructure that Amazon has created? That structure where, you know, the delivery system, the computerization, the ability to order instantaneously and so on. They could have lived with a handicraft industry that was producing consumer items out the kazoo, and it wouldn't have affected or threatened the very nature of that system at all. Would have posed no threat to it. They could have allowed much more of entrepreneurship on a low level, and that could have floated up to the top, and it would have just completely changed the image that people have of what socialism was, and it would have overcame many of the problems that they faced in planning. Planning is a difficult thing. It's very tough. So yeah, I'm glad you wrote that article. I'm glad it got a lot of interest. That's the kind of thing that pulls the curtain back and doesn't mince words. It doesn't hide socialism under some kind of touchy-feely social justice mantra. That's the hardcore of it.
Well, I think we better wrap things up. I'm going to link to your. Are you still going to be doing your what's left, or are you still posting there periodically, right?
I do,
Yeah.
yes.
And I'll link to your active on X or Twitter or whatever the hell they call it anymore. So that's good. I like your comments. They're always kind of a side smear. You got a good sense of humor with what you post on that. And look forward to your war book. I'm really looking forward to your war book. That doesn't sound right, but keep at that. I hope that one comes out. And
Yeah. Keep
go
working
from
on
there.
war, Stephen.
And if you are ever, coming down to cross the border, let me, I'm always good for a cup of coffee. Greg's good for a glass of wine.
If you
Just don't,
try and escape the
bring your
authorities, you can
burner.
stay with me.
Bring your
Yeah,
burner phone. Don't bring your real phone. Just bring a burner phone when you come across. That's my only advice to you.
Give
So,
us a ring. We're
yes.
happy
My
to have you
daughter,
over.
my daughter crossed the border just recently, and her mother was very concerned about this. She made sure that she wiped clean all of her social media before.
oh God, I'm no, that's serious. I had friends that were I have a horror story I can tell you about my daughter-in-law coming through immigration, and the way she was treated in ICE, and Jesus criminy.
Well, Canada's no it's no socialist country. Let's not kid ourselves. I went to a Peace Council meeting, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, and we were crossing, and they asked you at the border, the Canadian authorities said, well, where are you going in Toronto? What are you going to do? And I said, well, I'm going to a peace meeting. And the guy says, why are you coming here? We don't make wars. You guys do. You should be staying back in the States. Then I went over about 5 years ago, and a guy asked what we're doing. And I said, I'm going to a Communist Party meeting. And he pulled us over and did all the usual kind of stuff you expect. Of course, he had that barbed wire across his arm, big muscles and stuff. But he put us through the anti-communist treatment, and so we got delayed for about an hour and a half. But
Well, at least they didn't
so
shoot at you.
it's contagious. That kind of right wing crap is contagious. Well, you have it too. You have it you almost elected a Trump. You have to
Yeah,
thank
yeah, you're
Trump
pretty close.
you have to thank Trump
You
for
got to
getting
thank Trump for
elected.
that.
Yeah.
So, Keep at
Yeah,
it.
well, yeah.
Good.
But if you consider the person who was elected was far better than the alternative. But if you look at him, I mean, he has an interesting background. He presents himself as, an average, everyday Canadian. But where was he educated? He was educated at Harvard. He got his PhD at Oxford. As soon as he got his PhD at Oxford, he started working for Goldman Sachs
It's fun.
around the world, various places in the United States, in Japan, elsewhere. And then he only came back to Canada so he could run the central bank. And after he left the central bank in Canada, he was recruited to run the central bank in England. And after he did that, that's when he finally came back to Canada after so many years of being away from Canada and became the head of an asset management company. So he's very much like Draghi, who was the head of the European Central Bank, who the Italians recruited to help them run their country. But, he obviously has an internationalist perspective. He's hardly a Canadian. Um, he ran, they had to find him a riding in which he could run, because you have to be a member of parliament to be the prime minister in Canada. He lives in Ottawa, in the richest neighborhood in Ottawa, but they ran him in a suburban neighborhood in which I raised my family. And he claimed that this was the kind of neighborhood in which he raised his own family. And I thought he would never, it would have been beneath his dignity to raise his family in that neighborhood.
Well, we've got Pritzker, who's pretty close to equivalent to Elon Musk in his billionaire status, and he's our new, great white hope or great liberal hope or whatever. So I don't know. Hey, it's been fun. I always enjoy chatting with you, and this has been, I really, really enjoyed this. So keep at it, give them hell, and we'll see you
Write
when you're.
more, write more.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Write more, write more. So, thanks so much, Steve. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.